Welcome to part 3 of our expense claim approval tutorial. In this section, we will assemble the forms, also called user interfaces, that users will use to interact with the expense claim application. For steps 7 through 14, this includes the forms used to submit, approve, resubmit, or process expense claims. To move forward, we will be editing the SmartForms that K2 generated for our application, and we will be adding our own views and forms along with integrating these forms with the data objects that were created in part 2. However, we will not be integrating these forms with a workflow just yet. That will happen as we move on to part 4. In step 7, we will edit the new expense claim SmartForm view that was generated by K2. We will be deleting some fields from this view since the user does not need to provide the values, and mark other fields as read-only fields based on our requirements. If you're not already there, go into the expense claim list in your Sharepoint site. Then from the List tab at the top of the page, you can open up the K2 Application Elements page from the K2 button group. Once that opens up, we want to check out the new expense claim view to edit it. So you can right-click on that view in the list here, and select Checkout from the context menu that pops up. Once you have that checked out, make sure to reselect the new expense claim view if it isn't selected, and then click Edit from the top menu to open it up. Since this view will be for an employee creating a new review, we don't really need the Approver or Finance comments boxes to be available here, so we can delete those text boxes and labels from the form by selecting them and then deleting them. We also don't need the approval date, process date, or status fields when this is filled out, so we can delete those fields and their associated labels from the form as well. Once you get done with that, we can tidy up the form, so let's go ahead and remove these blank rows from the view by selecting a row and then clicking the Delete Row button from the menu here at the top. And I'll just go ahead and do that for all of these that we want to remove. These next fields that we're going to look at do not need to be editable, so let's change the Submit Date and Total Amount text boxes to Data Label Controls as shown on my screen. You can select a control to do this, and then select the Change Control button from the menu, and select Data Label. When you're done with those two tasks, your view should now look something like this. Let's move on to the next task. We want to select a new Total Amount Data Label control that we just created and change its style to be a number format with 2 decimal places. You can get to the Styles property over here in the Properties section for this control, and then select the ellipses button. To utilize the decimal option, you can change the language region setting to Use, and then that should be all you have to do since 2 decimal places is the default. You can close that window out and then move on and select the Submit Date data label. To change the style property to display short date, you can switch the user settings to use English and select Type Short Date as shown here. You can close this window out when you're ready as well. Next, when a user fills out this form, we want to set the Submit Date's value to default to the current date. We can do this by adding an expression to the Submit Date properties using the Expression Editor window that's accessible from the Properties area. Once you get into this window, go ahead and click the Add button to create a new expression. Name the new expression Current Date, and then drag the Current Date option over to the empty box from the context browser. This lives under the System Values Current Date group as shown here. Once you get that set up, click OK on the Add Expression window, and then click OK again to close the Select Expression window. You should see that the Submit Date is set to default to the current date using the expression that you just defined. Next, select the Save and Cancel buttons, and then uncheck each of their visible properties. We don't want to show these controls on this view to users because the plan is to add our own controls to another form that this view will live in to control this behavior later on. At the same time, do not delete these controls because we are going to reuse the rule set for the cancel button later on as well. Now that we have that complete, let's add a rule to set the value of the requester lookup control to the current user. We do want users to be able to submit expense claims on behalf of other users. For example, assistants could submit claims on behalf of their managers, but also to save time and effort for users if they are filling out their own expense claim, we will auto-populate the requester field with the current user, and then they can change it later on if desired. To do this, go ahead and select the Rules menu icon at the top of the page to view the rules for this particular K2 view. Once you're in there, select the rule When the View Executed Initialize, and then click the Edit Rule button. On the left-hand Actions pane, we want to find the action called Execute a Controls Method. This may take a bit of time to find visually, so to speed this up, you can actually type in Execute a Control in the search box here at the top, and then hit Enter. Or you can click the search icon to filter the list of actions. Once that pops up, you can select the Execute a Controls Method action to add it to the list of actions for the rule in the right-hand pane. Notice after doing this, the new rule drops in at the bottom. We actually want this rule now to work on the requester picker. So click on the Select Control link in the Action configuration, and then select Requester Picker from the list. And then configure the action next to that to call the resolve method of the picker control, as you can see here on my screen. Finally, to configure this rule, select the Configure link to set up the action that this rule will take. This is where we have the control populated with contextual information, which will actually be the current user's username. So using the context browser, open up System Values, and then the current user group, and from there drag the current user email property into the value text box, and then click Finish. That's going to complete this task, so you can go ahead and click OK to close the Rule Designer window. We're done editing the new expense claim view, so you can click Finish to close out the View Designer as well. Let's check the impact of the changes we have made. To do this, go ahead and open up the expense claim list back in your SharePoint site, and once you get that list open, add a new item to the list. With the changes we just made, we should see that the form populates the requester field with our logged in name, and it also sets the submit date to today. Notice also that the fields we removed from the view do not appear on this form at this point. This looks pretty good, so let's briefly review what we just did. In this step, we edited the view that is used to capture details of a new expense claim item. We removed unnecessary fields, and we also used expressions, styles, and rules to set the default values for fields on the view. We also learned how to use contextual information to retrieve values like the current date and the current user's email address. Let's move on to the next step, where we're going to edit the generated display view for this list. In step 8, we will edit the display expense claim SmartForm view that was generated by K2. This is a pretty short step in that we will only be removing a single button from the view to prevent users from editing items in the list directly. We're setting the view up this way because it will eventually be used on a form for the workflow, approval, and finance processing tasks. Take a moment to get yourself back to the K2 Elements page for the expense claim list, and then check out and edit the display expense claim view. Once you have this view open, go ahead and set the visible property for the close and edit buttons to false or unchecked so that the buttons will not show on the view. And once you've completed that, go ahead and click Finish to go back to the K2 Elements page. And then from here, you can right-click the Display Expense Claim view and check it in. Keep in mind, we still want to use the rules behind these buttons later on, but we will be controlling this view from a form that will have functionality tied to the approval and finance processing task actions. Step 9, also being a fairly short step, will involve editing the generated Edit Expense Claim view. We're going to customize this view to prepare it for use within the Workflow Rework task. Starting from the K2 Elements page again, check out and edit the Edit Expense Claim view. Once this view opens up, let's delete the process date control and its label, and also remove its row from the view. Next, we want to use the Change Control menu button to change the following fields to data label controls: Submit Date, Approval Date, Total Amount, and Status. We want to set these controls to read-only because they are data values that we want to control with the system rather than allowing users to change these values, especially in the Rework Task Assignment step. Once you get that done, we also want to set the visible property for the Save and Cancel buttons to false so that the buttons will not be displayed. Finally, we can set the read-only property for the Approver Comments and Finance Comments text boxes on the view to true so that users cannot edit these fields. We do want the user to be able to view the feedback from the Approver or Finance Department so that they can fix their expense claim accordingly. That's all we need to change on this view, so from here you can click Finish at the bottom of the page to complete the edit changes. Now, we can move on to step 10, where we will create a new list view that will be used to display a read-only list of expense claim line items. This view will be used in the approval steps of the workflow so that the approver and processor can review the items attached to the expense claim, but they will not be able to change any of the items. Let's go ahead and get this step started from the K2 Application Elements page for the expense claim list. Now, this page may take a few seconds to open up if you're not already there, but when it does come up, we can click on the New button and select the View option. Once that opens up, we'll begin with the General screen, so to get there, you can click Next if you're on the Introduction screen, or go ahead and click the General menu option here at the top of the page. And then we'll configure it as follows. For the name of this view, call it Expense Claim Line Items List. For the description, we'll make it a read-only list of expense claim line items. For category, you can go ahead and leave the default value. And for view type, select List View, mainly because this will show us a list of items as opposed to a single item on the page. For the data source, use the Browse icon and go ahead and select the Expense Claim Line Item Smart Object. This is going to be the smart object that we want to display on the list view. Now keep in mind your values may be a bit different from mine on the screen here based on your environment. For the list method, if it's not already set by default, select Get List. And then finally, uncheck the option, Call this method when the form loads, because we do not want the list view to populate automatically every time the page is opened for this view. I'll give you a few seconds to catch up, and when your screen looks like mine here, you can go ahead and click the Next button to move on to the Layout screen. Okay, great. We can use this window to set up our view with controls, so click the Create Labels and Controls link. And next, on the Create Labels and Controls dialog window, we want to select all the fields except for ID and Expense Claim ID. You can do that here, and then easily just uncheck ID and uncheck Expense Claim ID. Remember, we want this list to be read-only, so do not select the Enable List Editing checkbox under the Edit Options section. These are pretty much all the settings we need to configure on this screen, so click OK to move on, where we'll take a look at the layout of the list view. The only column we're going to update on this view is the description column, so go ahead and select this description column here, and in the Body tab of the Properties pane, enable the Wrap Text property. This is going to ensure that the full text of the column shows up when users are viewing the page. That's pretty much it, so you can click Finish to close and save the new view. Let's do a quick recap. In this step, we added a new read-only display view for expense claim line items. We're going to use this view on the approval and processing forms of the application. And in the next step, we're going to create a new editable list view, which will be used to capture the expense claim line items. With step 11, we are going to create a new editable list view that will be used to capture, edit, and remove line items for the expense claim. This view will eventually be used on the form that handles starting the workflow and in the form for the rework step of the workflow. Now, let's walk through step 11 by starting from the K2 Application Elements page again. Click on the New menu option and select View. Once this page opens up, you can go ahead and move to the General tab by clicking Next here at the bottom of the page. And then from the Configure the General Settings page for this new view, let's configure it as follows. Let's name it Expense Claim Line Items Edit List. We can go ahead and give it a description of Editable List of Expense Claim Line Items. For category, go ahead and leave the default. For view type, change it to List View. And then for our data source, use the Browse icon again and change it down to the Expense Claim Line Items Smart Object. Once you get through that, for the list method, make sure it's set to getList. It should be set to this as the default. And then here at the bottom of the page, set the option called Call This Method When the Form Loads to be not checked, since again in this view we do not want the list view to populate automatically whenever this page is open. Once you get to this point and your screen looks like mine, go ahead and click Next to move on to the Layout screen. On this Layout screen, you can click the Create Labels and Controls link to select the fields to display on the view. And as we did in the Read-Only view in the last step, on the Create Labels and Controls window, select all the fields except for ID and Expense Claim ID. This time around, we actually want to select the Enable List Editing option and configure the Edit Options section with the following settings. Make sure Edit All Rows is selected. Then for Allow the user to add new rows, put a check there and make sure it's set with the Create method. For Allow the user to edit existing rows, make sure that's checked with the Save method. Allow the user to remove rows should be checked and make sure it's set to the Delete method. The Enable Add New Row link, make sure that's checked. And we can leave the additional settings alone at this point and click OK to move on. Great, now that our table and controls are generated for us, let's take some time to configure some of the objects on this layout. You can start with selecting the Save button in the toolbar and set its visible property to false. This button isn't really going to be necessary for users to see on this page since they can edit rows directly in the table. Next, select the description column and then in the Body tab of the Properties pane, you can enable the Wrap Text property just like we did in the previous step for the Read-Only list view. We also want to change the format and style for the money fields on this view now so they reflect as decimals. Start by selecting the Amount text box here at the bottom of the list view, and then open the Styles option for this control, and configure the number format for it to have 2 decimal places by selecting the Use Radio option here and click OK. Moving up above this text box, configure the number format for the Amount column's body to also have 2 decimal places. You can select the Amount column from the list and be sure that the Body tab is selected over in the Properties pane on the right. You can then select the Styles option again, and as before, select the Use option for English and set decimal places to 2 if it isn't already set. Go ahead and click OK to close that up. Now, take a few seconds to follow that same procedure to set the number format for the USD amount text box and the USD columns body to have 2 decimal places. While you quickly run through this task, keep in mind some of the other options available to you here. Within the Style Builder window, you can change to various other formats if necessary, change fonts, borders around the selected object, margins, and cell padding. Another thing we can do is apply an aggregation to a column such as row count, summing the column, figuring out the average, and so on. Select the USD amount column and then in the Properties of the Column tab, click the Sum aggregation to add a sum value for all the expense line items. Notice the label for this new field is called Sum where it was added to the bottom of the list view. Since that isn't very descriptive, let's select this new field and rename it to Sum USD Amount Let's make this field readable as a money value, so use the styles property to configure the number format for the sum to have 2 decimal places, just like all the other number fields on the view that we just did this for. And then also format the font so that the control text is right aligned, and then click OK when you're done. Now we're going to set up the currency drop-down menu to retrieve its data from the currency smart object that we created earlier. I want to do this so we can illustrate how to populate a drop-down list control with data from a smart object. Select the currency code text box and use the Change Control menu button here at the top to change it to a drop-down list control. And then once you get that done, from the Properties panel under the Data Source group, you can click the ellipses next to the Type property, and within the Configure Data Source window, use the Browse button to locate the expense claim currency smart object that we created earlier. Now keep in mind, your values may look a little bit different from mine based on your environment and how you named your smart objects. Since there is only one property for this particular smart object, the rest of the screen should be configured correctly. So you can click OK to close the Configure Data Source window. Next, we will configure a rule which will call the same smart object to perform a currency conversion function based on an event that a user will trigger on the form. Essentially, this will be when the user enters an amount, changes the date, or selects a currency code for a particular line item. You can select the amount text box here at the bottom, and then open the Rules panel for the control. Once you get there, click the Add Rule button. We're going to change the event to fire when the control is changed. Notice how I set that here. And then select the Conditions tab on the lower left-hand pane. With this rule, we really only want it to execute if there are values entered for the data, amount, and currency code controls. This can be done by setting a rule condition. So in the Conditions tab, you can click the A Control Contains a Value condition 3 times to add 3 conditions over here on the right. And then configure the conditions so that the rule is executed only if the amount text box, the currency code drop-down list, and the date calendar controls have values. You can do this by clicking on Select Control for each condition line, and then select the desired controls as shown on my screen. We need to set up an action to fire off now when these conditions are met, so select the Actions tab on the left-hand panel, and then look for and select the action Execute a Smart Object method and add it to the rule. Click the link called Select Smart Object and use the tree browser to drill down and select the Expense Claim Currency Smart Object. You can close that out once you've selected it. We can pick the method we want to call here by clicking on the Select Method link, and then select the Calculate USD Amount method. Basically, if all 3 values are entered in for this rule, we can pass them into this function to convert the cost of the line item to US dollars. Again, you can hook into virtually any service you know of with the Smart Object configuration to perform this function for any currency type, not just US dollars. Click on the Configure link since we need to set up the input values and return values for this method. You can configure the input parameters for the method as shown on my screen by dragging controls from the Add Edit row of the Expense Claim Line Items Edit List Controls group in the context browser and drop those into the input parameters for the method. You can see how I did that on my screen right here. Be sure to pull in the currency code drop-down list, amount text box, and date calendar here. Once you get that done, click Next to move on to the Output Mapping screen. Then open up the Calculate USD Amount group's return properties and drag the USD amount return value into the USD amount text box, and then click Finish once you've completed that task. And that completes this phase of the rule setup. Let's take a quick pause to recap what we just did. We just set up a rule that will call a Smart Object method when the user enters a value for the amount, date, and currency fields. The Smart Object will in turn call the sample currency web service and pass in the date, amount, and currency entered by the user. We want to perform this same action if the user changes the currency or changes the date value, But instead of reconfiguring the entire rule for those two controls, we will just call this existing rule to save time. Let's take a look at how we can reuse rules across other controls on a form. Go ahead and select the Date Calendar control and add a rule that fires when the control is changed. For the rule actions, you can select Execute Another Rule this time and configure this action to call the When Amount Text Box is Changed rule. That's it, so click OK to complete the rule designer. Let's follow the same procedure to add a rule for the currency code drop-down list that fires when the currency is changed. And then configure the rule to call the When Amount Text Box is Changed rule. You can go ahead and click OK to complete the rule designer, and then click Finish to complete editing the view. With that view set up the way we want, let's go ahead and give it a test. We can test views by opening the view's URL and opening it up in a browser. To get to this, in your K2 Application Elements page, locate the new Expense Claim Line Items Edit List view that you just created. Right-click this view and select Properties. Now this page may take a second to load up, but once it does load, on the Properties screen of the view, click the Runtime URL link to open the view in a browser. And you'll notice your URL value may be different than the one shown on my screen due to the different environments we're working in. You may also need to click the drop-down arrow in the top right-hand side of the screen to show your properties if it's not there. Once the view is open, click the Add New Row link or Add button in the toolbar. If everything worked as expected, you should see the category drop-down list populated with values, and remember, these come from the Azure SQL database. And the currency drop-down list is also populated, where these values came from the sample web service. When you enter a date, amount, and currency, you should also see that the US dollar amount is calculated. This calculation is performed by that same sample web service. And if you add a new row to the list view, you should see that the sum is recalculated down here at the bottom of the screen. At this point in time, we won't be able to save any of these line items because the line items need to be associated with an expense claim. We will set that up when we build the forms, so for now you can just close the browser window since you have run through and verified that the view is working as expected. Let's quickly review what we just did here in step 11. In this step, we created an editable list view that the requester will use to add expense line items to their expense claim. We also learned how to add aggregations to columns, how to use smart objects to populate drop-down lists, how to add rules to perform calculation functions with smart objects, and how to reuse rules defined for other controls. Now, in the next step, we will start building the forms for this application. Next up, with step 12, we will edit the generated form used to capture new expense claim items. We will be adding the editable list view that is used to capture the line items, and actually this view is the view that we just created in the preceding step. We'll be adding it onto the form. And then we'll add some buttons and rules in for user interaction. Now, keep in mind, in a later step of this tutorial, we will be setting up this same form to be the form that starts the expense claim approval workflow. Starting on the K2 Application Elements page, let's check out the new expense claim form and then edit the form by clicking the Edit menu button here at the top of the page. We're going to work with this form first so that we can add in the list view used to capture expense claim line items for our users. This may take a few seconds for this to open up, but once it does open up, take a moment to actually expand the My Items category tree view over here on the left and locate the expense claim line items edit list view that you created in the previous step, but at this point do not click on the view. Using the My Items category group, you can find views and forms that you've created personally. This helps speed up things rather than drilling through the All Items category tree, which can get pretty deep in certain environments. Now, drag and drop the expense claim line items edit list view onto the form layout just below the header view. Let's rename the view heading here by clicking on the Inner View title line and change its heading to Expense Claim Items. Our users won't be able to do much with this form without buttons. So let's add 2 of them onto the view so that the user can submit or cancel this form. Let's put some structure to the button layout before we do this. So from the Controls Toolbox tab over here on the right, locate, drag, and drop a layout table onto the bottom of the form. And when prompted, configure the table to have 1 row and 3 columns. Once you have that configured, then you can drag 2 buttons into the layout table cells as shown here on my screen. We also want to make this a little bit more orderly, so once you get the buttons into the table, click the Align Right toolbar button to align each of the buttons to the right-hand side of each cell. Now select the first button and change its name to Button Submit using the Properties box over here on the right, and then change the text property to just the word Submit. Now select the second button and change its name to Button Cancel, and then set its text property to the word Cancel. Before we get into the rule behavior for this form, let's change the width of it for our users. Click anywhere in the white area outside of the views and then set the form's width property over here in the Properties box to 90%. This is going to help keep it from stretching out too far when a form is maximized. The next task will involve adding a rule to copy the sum USD amount value from the expense claim line items view to the expense claim header view whenever the sum USD amount control changes. This is something that we want to do automatically for our users, so go to the rule screen for the form and then add a new rule by clicking the button here. On the Events tab, find and click the When a control on a view raises an event option and add it over on the right-hand side. Let's rename this rule first, so double-click Enter Rule Name and rename it to Transfer Total Amount. You can change the name of a rule to make it more readable later on, especially if you want to locate and reuse it often. You should be more comfortable with rules at this point, so follow my lead here and configure the rule to fire when the sum USD amount control on the expense claim line items edit list view is changed. Now select the Actions tab over on the lower left side of the window and use the search box to quickly locate the transfer data action. We will need to have an action to do the heavy lifting of copying the USD sum up to the expense claim header. Once the action is inserted on the right side, go ahead and click the Configure link. And then on the Transfer Data screen, drag the sum USD amount from the footer of the Edit List view into the Total Amount data label for the expense item view. Once you get there, go ahead and click OK, and then click OK again to complete setting up the rule. Now use the breadcrumb bar at the top of the View Designer to go back to the layout screen for the form, since we still need to configure the buttons we added to the form earlier. Let's start by setting up a rule for the Cancel button. We're going to have the form prompt the user to confirm that they really want to close or cancel the form when they click this button. Select the Cancel button and then add a new rule for it in the Rules tab on the right side of the page. For the event that starts the rule, let's configure it to fire when a control on the form raises an event, and then configure that to when button Cancel is clicked. Let's rename this rule to Confirm Cancellation by double-clicking on the Header tab here at the top and entering that in as the new name. Great! Now to add our actions, select the Actions tab, and for the first action, locate and select the Get Confirmation from User action. Once you find that, configure this action as follows. For Specify Heading, go ahead and enter in Confirm Cancel. Then for the Specify Message option, enter in Are you sure you want to cancel? Next, within the Actions pane, select the Execute Another Rule action. And then configure this rule to call the On New Expense Claim When Cancel Button is Clicked rule. You can click OK once you're ready. What we are going to do here is call the existing rule that is already set up to close the form and redirect the user back to the Sharepoint list. Instead of configuring that entire rule again, we are just reusing the rule that already exists on a view within the form. Okay, with that button configured, now we can start setting up the rule actions that will create the expense claim header item and the individual line items that are attached to the expense claim. So let's select the Submit button and then add a new rule that fires when the Submit button is clicked. Switch over to the Conditions tab for this rule and locate and select the Form Passes Validation and then click the Configure link. Now configure the validation so that the following controls are all required: the title text box, the requester picker, the approver picker, and total amount data label. And once you've completed that task, click OK to move on. Click the Actions tab again and add an action to get confirmation from the user with the following settings. For Specify heading, go ahead and enter in Confirm Submit. And then for the Specify Message setting, put in, "Are you sure you want to submit this expense claim for approval?" Add another action by searching for Execute a View method, and then select it, and then configure it to call the Create List Item method of the new expense claim view. Once you get that on there, we need to configure this Create List Item method to map the correct properties so that data can be saved back to the data source. For this example, from the Input Mapping screen, we can actually click the Auto Map button to automatically map the fields on the form to the input properties of the method. Once you get that far, click Next to move on to the Output Mapping screen. So in here, we need to drag and drop the ID property into the ID of the expense claim smart object from the context browser. We're doing this because we need to use this expense claim's header ID when we create each of the line items that are associated with this particular expense claim. Now click Finish to complete the configuration of the action. Let's move on now and start configuring the saving rules for the line items associated with an expense claim. You can add another action to execute a view method for items that are in a specific state, and then configure this action to execute the Create method of the expense claim line items Edit List view for all the items that have been added. Once your screen looks like mine, you can click on the Configure link. On the Input Mapping screen, click on the New Expense Claim View context grouping, and then expand the Expense Claim Smart Object and drag the ID property over to the Expense Claim ID Input property. When you do this, be sure to map it to the Expense Claim ID Input property, not the ID property. We are doing this because when the expense claim header is saved, we will get back the resulting ID. We then want to take this ID and pass it into each of the expense claim line items that must be associated with the expense claim header. This is basically how K2 does this. In simple terms, we are telling the action to take the ID of the parent record, which happens to be the expense claim header that was just created by the rule, and then pass that ID into the expense claim ID property of all the children, in other words, the expense claim line items, so that we know which line items are associated with which expense claim. If you're familiar with keys, think of this as setting the foreign key of the associated records. Now, we need to map the remaining input values, so on the Input Mapping screen, expand the Expense Claim Line Items Edit List, and then expand the Expense Claim Line Items Smart Object. From there, drag the properties for the Smart Object into the Input Mappings boxes as shown here. I'll pull in Category, Payee, Date, Description, Amount, Currency Code, USD Amount, and Receipt. Something to think about here and remember, when you are using an editable list where you could potentially have added multiple items, this is going to be the way that you have to map the input properties for the list method. They have to map from the smart object that is associated with the editable list. You should not use the controls on the edit list, but rather the properties of the smart object bound to the list, and then K2 will handle it from there. Once you get done with all that, go ahead and click Next, and then Finish to complete the rule action configuration. After saving the claim back to the data source, we want to show the user a confirmation message with the ID of their new expense claim. To make this happen, add another action to show a message to the user, and then click the Configure link to set up the message. Let's configure it as follows, while at the same time we drag values from the context browser over for the title and the ID. For message size, just set it to medium. For message type, you can just leave it as default. For title, enter in the word success. For heading, enter in expense claim submitted. And then in the body, put your expense claim for title has been submitted. The reference number is ID, so where title is and ID is, drop those in from the context browser. Finally, we want to redirect the user back to the Sharepoint site after they have read the confirmation message. We can do this by adding another action in to execute another rule, and then configure this action to call the onNewExpenseClaim when cancel button is clicked rule. Notice we are reusing the rule we defined earlier for the cancel button. Since the data is already saved and committed, running the cancel button option will not undo the data that was captured and will only send the user back to the expense claim list. Next, let's set up the rule execution so that the data save operations all happen as a single batch action. This will improve performance of our form as it writes to the data sources. In the rule actions, select action called then on new expense claim view, execute the create list item method. Select on the then word and change it to also. Your screen should look like mine now, where the rule we just changed moved to execute under a batched grouping. Now in the rule definitions section, select the action called then on expense claim line items edit list view, execute the create method for all the items that have been added, and then on then change it to the word also. We've now set up the two data commitment actions to execute as a single batch task. So to recap, the rule does the following. When the user clicks the submit button, if the form passes validation, essentially all the relevant required fields have been entered, it will ask the user if they really want to submit the expense claim, and if they say yes, as a single operation it will create the expense claim header records and then create each of the line items that the user added to the expense claim, and then finally show a message to the user with the ID of the new expense claim header record and return the user to the Sharepoint site where they started from. Go ahead and click OK to complete the rule designer, and then click Finish to complete editing the new expense claim form. With the new expense claim form now set up, let's go ahead and test this form really quickly. Open your Sharepoint expense claim list and add a new item to the list. You should see your new form displayed, so go ahead and add some comments, pick an approver, and add some items to the form. You should see the total amount on the form update when you add new line items to the expense claim. So when you click Submit, you should see a confirmation message pop up. Click OK from there, and after a few seconds, you should see another message with the ID of the new expense claim. If you click OK again, you should be sent back to the expense claim items list, and you should see your new item in the list. That looks good, so let's do a quick review. In this step, we created a fairly complex form that leverages several SmartForms concepts, such as header detail views, reusing existing rules, using form rules to transfer values between views. We also ask the user for confirmation before continuing. We perform validation before executing certain rule actions, and we build in some execution blocks to control the grouping of rule actions. Now in the next step, we will edit the form that is used to edit the expense claim item. In step 13, we will walk you through creating a new view that will be used to capture the comments and decisions from the approver and finance processing tasks of the workflow. We will then edit the form that is used to display information for expense claims and add the read-only list of expense claim items to this form. This form will eventually be used in the workflow for the approval and finance processing tasks, as I mentioned, so we will add the workflow tasks view to the form. And then later on in the tutorial, we will actually be using form states to determine the behavior of this form when it is being used for the approval and finance processing tasks separately within the workflow. For the first part of this step, let's create a new view that will hold the controls we will use to enable workflow integration for the display form. This view is going to be used for the approval and finance processing steps of the workflow. So starting in the K2 Application Elements page, you can click on the New icon here at the top in the menu, and then select View. This page may take a few seconds to load up. Once you get in there, go ahead and click on the General Settings menu option at the top, and then we'll configure this view as follows. For the name, go ahead and call it Expense Claim Workflow Controls. You can add whatever you'd like in the description box. For mine, I'll put in Controls for the Approval and Finance Processing Tasks. And then for category, go ahead and leave the default set as it is. For view type, set it to Item View. And then clear out the data source box because we're not going to really need a data source or a smart object for this view. And then when you're ready, go ahead and click Next. So with moving on to the layout screen, you can click the Create Layout Table Only link and then create a table with 3 columns and 2 rows. Then from the Controls pane, drag a label and a radio button list to the top left-hand cell of the table. Your screen should look similar to mine when you're through. Let's add a little context to this form by changing the text property for the label that we just dropped on it to the word Decision. You can select it first, and then over in the Properties area here on the right, enter the word Decision in the text property box. Then in similar fashion, let's change the name of the radio button list to Radio Button List Decision. And once you're done with that, let's go ahead and clear out the watermark property since we really don't have a need for that text. Now I want you to organize the table cells a little more intuitively, and we can perform this task by using the Merge Cells toolbar button to merge the 2 right-hand cells of the top row in the table as shown here on my screen. First, select the middle cell, and then click the Merge Cell to the Right button in the menu. Now let's add a couple controls here. Drag a label control and a text area control into the top right-hand cell of this table. Then change the text property of the label to Comments. We want to set up an area for reviewers to add comments about their decision in this particular area. Finally, change the name property of the text area control to Text Area Comments. Great, now your view should look like mine once you reach this point. We need to give the users the ability to submit or cancel this form, so let's drop some buttons at this point. Drag 2 buttons from the Controls pane to the lower right 2 cells of the table, similar to what we did in the previous step. Once you get those in there, right align the table cells as I demonstrate here, and then let's take a moment to configure some properties for these buttons to add some context to them. For the first button, let's call it Button Submit, with Submit as its text, and then make the second button Button Cancel, with Cancel as its text. Again, make sure your view looks like mine at this point, as we're going to be using this control later on to manually control actions for the workflow as we present them to the users. When you're ready, go ahead and click Finish to complete the View Designer and go back to the Application Elements screen for the expense claim list. Now that we have created the view to hold the workflow task controls, let's take a moment to edit the form that will be used for displaying the expense claim information during execution of an actual workflow. To do that, let's check out and edit the Display Expense Claim form. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Once your page opens up, go over into the Layout section for the form. And then I want you to drag and drop the Expense Claim Line Items List view onto the bottom of the form. Once you get that there, change the title of the view to Expense Claim Items. Now we'll leave that there. We're going to do a little bit more to configure this view in a few minutes. Because we'll have users making decisions with this read-only form, we are going to manually drop in the workflow controls by dragging the Expense Claim Workflow Controls view onto the bottom of this form layout as well. This is actually the view that we just created. Once you have that in place, I want you to set the visible property of the Expense Claim Workflow Controls view to false. Make a mental note here. We really only want to use this view when the form is used for workflow tasks. We'll configure the way that works here in a little bit. Now let's do a quick check on the width of the form. Click anywhere on the white area of the form outside of the views and set the form's width property to 90%. And then skip over to the Rules section for the form, where we're going to configure the Initialize rule to pull in expense claim line items when the form opens. So locate and edit the When the Form is Initializing rule. Select the Actions pane and then add an action in to execute a view method. Once that's over on the right-hand side of the window, configure this new action to call the GetList method of the Expense Claim Line Items List view, similar to mine on the screen. And then click on the Configure link where we'll set up the action. Right now, we only want to show the line items associated with this specific expense claim. So on the Input Mapping screen, all you need to do is drag and drop the ID parameter into the Expense Claim ID input property. Click Finish to complete setting up this action configuration, and then click OK to complete the Rule Designer. And finally, click Finish to complete the Display Form Designer, and that will take you back to the Expense Claim Application Elements list. Let's stop real quick here and check up with what we've done so far in this step. We set up this display form to load the list of expense items associated with an expense claim, and we also added in a control that we're going to use later on to handle some workflow task assignment functions for the user. Before we move on to the next step, let's take a moment and test this form out and make sure our changes are working. In your expense claim list in SharePoint, open the test item that you created in the previous step. You should see the view load with the data of your test item along with the individual line items added to your expense claim. If you added images to the line items for the claim, you should also be able to click on the image to view the expense claim line items receipt. The view containing the workflow tasks should not show up because we will only show that view when the form is being used for a workflow task. So great, this looks pretty good. Let's take a moment and review. In this step, we created a new view that will hold the workflow controls for the approve and finance processing tasks. We also moved on to edit the form used to display expense claim information, and we added the read-only list of expense claim items, as well as adding in the workflow controls view for this form. Later on in this tutorial, we will add rules to those controls to hook the form into the workflow. Step 14 is going to be the final step of the forms build tutorial. We will edit the form that is actually used to edit expense claims in this application. This edit form is only used in the workflow's rework task because we mainly do not want anyone to edit the expense claim itself outside of the context of the workflow. For this final step in the forms build, let's check out and edit the Edit Expense Claim form from the Application Elements page. While this loads up, to be consistent with the other forms in this application, we're going to set the form's width property to 90%. So if you can get over to the Layouts page, if you recall, you can do this by clicking in the white space outside of any of the views and then update the width property for the form over here on the right side of the page. We'll go ahead and set that to 90%. Next, from the context browser, let's drag and drop the expense claim line items edit list onto the bottom of the form and change the view title to expense claim items. This is similar to how we did it in the previous steps of this tutorial. Now, we will also need to set up a rule to populate this list of expense claim line items when the form is opened. So jump over to the Rules screen for the form and locate and edit the When the Form is Initializing rule. Let's add in the rule action to execute a view method. And then we'll configure the rule as follows. Make sure it calls the getList method of the expense claim line items edit list view. Okay, great. With that, you can click on the configure link to set up the getList method so that it populates the parameters it needs to pull data back. Beginning on the input mapping screen, let's drag the ID parameter into the expense claim ID input property. Now make sure that you actually drag and drop this ID parameter into the correct input property. Make sure it's the expense claim ID and not the ID property right here. Let's go ahead and click Finish to complete the input mappings, and then click OK to complete the rule designer. We have now set up the form so that it will load the list of expense claim line items for the expense claim list item that's being edited. This parent-child relationship is going to be tied together using the ID parameter that forms part of the query string for the form at runtime. Next, let's add some buttons onto the view so that users can resubmit the claim, cancel the claim, or actually close the form. Let's do that by jumping back over to the layout screen of the form designer. Then we can put some structure in for the buttons by going into the Controls toolbox over here on the right, locate and drag and drop a layout table onto the bottom of the form, and configure the table to have 1 row and 4 columns this time. Once your table is ready, let's drag 3 buttons into this layout table so that your screen looks like mine. Make sure they start in these columns. We want to right align each of these buttons, so select the button and then click the right align menu option from the top. And let's do this for all 3 of these. We're going to configure the rules for these buttons later on, but for now let's actually configure the 3 buttons using the following settings in the properties. For this first button, let's call it Button Resubmit Claim, and then for its text, just call it Resubmit Claim. For the second button, let's name it Button Cancel Claim, and then drop in the text property Cancel Claim. Finally, for the third button, let's name it Button Close Form, and for its text, just enter in Close Form. Let's move on and add a rule now to copy the total USD amount value from the expense claim line items list up to the expense claim header view whenever the sum USD amount control changes. Now we did this in a previous form in much the same way, so go over to the rules screen for the form, and when you get there, click Add New Rule. For this event, select when a control on a view raises an event and configure the rule to fire when the sum USD amount control on the expense claim line items edit list view is changed. Then on the Actions tab, locate and select Transfer Data. When you're ready, you can click the Configure link to set up the action. On the Transfer Data screen, drag the sum USD amount from the footer of the Edit List view into the Total Amount data label for the expense item view. Now I want to emphasize again, make sure you use the field from the footer row, then drag the sum USD amount over to the Edit Expense Claim Views Controls group and drop it in the Total Amount data label. And then click OK. You can also click OK here again to complete setting up the rule, since that's all we need to do to make this data transfer happen. We need to make sure that the user can close the form out, so next let's set up the rule for the Close Form button that we dropped on the page a few minutes ago. In doing this, let's prompt the user to confirm that they want to close the form. Go ahead and add a rule, and then select when a control on the form raises an event, and configure to fire when the button Close Form is clicked. Then from the Actions tab, select the Get Confirmation from User action, and then over on the right, configure this action with the following values. For Specify Heading, just go ahead and type in Confirm Close, and then for the Specify Message box, add in Are you sure you want to close the form? If the user confirms, we need to add an action for the form to take at that point. So on the Actions tab again, let's locate and select the Execute Another Rule action and configure the rule to call the On Edit Expense Claim When Cancel Button is Clicked rule. Then when you're ready, you can click OK to complete the rule designer. Just a reminder here, what we are actually doing is calling an existing rule again that was already set up to close the form and redirect the user back to the Sharepoint list. By utilizing this capability for reuse of rules, we have just shaved a few minutes off of design time for our project. Now let's set up the rule actions that will execute when the user cancels the claim with the Cancel Claim button. Go ahead and add a rule to this button as shown on my screen, and configure it to execute when the Cancel button is clicked by using the event when a control on the form raises an event. Then you can add an action to get confirmation from the user that they want to cancel the claim with the following values. For Specify Heading, go ahead and add in Confirm Cancel Claim. And then for Specify Message, add in Are you sure you want to completely cancel this expense claim? It will not be resubmitted for approval, and I'll give you a few seconds to enter that in. Once you complete that, let's go back and add the Execute Another Rule action. Then we'll configure this one to call the On Edit Expense Claim When Cancel Button is Clicked rule. You can click OK when you get that completed. With the first two buttons set up, it's now time for us to set up the rule actions that will update the expense claim header item if the requester resubmits the claim. Because we want to save any changes that they may have made to the header data, we'll need to add a rule that fires when the button Resubmit claim is clicked to handle that task. But remember, we also want to perform some validation to ensure we have the required fields on this form filled out, similar to the new expense claim form. Select the Conditions tab now, and then add a condition so that the form must pass validation, and then click the Configure link. Let's configure the validation so that the title text box, requester picker, approver picker, and total amount label are all required, and click OK when you're done. This is going to follow a similar pattern to the new expense claim form. So from the Actions tab, let's add an action to get confirmation from the user with the following settings. For Specify Heading, go ahead and enter in Confirm Resubmit. And then for Specify Message, go ahead and enter in Are you sure you want to resubmit this expense claim for approval? Now add another action to execute a view method, and configure the action to call the Update List Item method of the Edit Expense Claim view. Once you get that set up, click on the Configure link where we'll set up the Update List Item method with its parameters. Let's start out on the Input Mapping screen, so expand the Edit Expense Claim node, then expand the Parameters node, and drag the ID parameter into the ID Input property like I'm doing here. Now let's expand the Controls node of the Expense Claim View group and drag the following controls onto the form. Take the Title text box, Requester picker, Approver picker, total amount data label, and finally the requester comments text area. Intuitively, we only need to update the values that can actually be changed by the user on this form. Once you get those dragged over to the input properties, you can click Finish to complete the mapping setup. We don't need to save the returned ID from the header like we did for the new item form because we already have it. Next, we need to add actions to add, edit, or delete any of the expense claim line items that were changed by the requester. So let's add an action that will add any new rows that the user may have added to the Edit Item List view. To do this, add another rule action to execute a view method for items that are in a specific state. And then configure it as follows. Let's execute the create method of the expense claim line items edit list view for all the items that have been added. You can see how I did this on my screen. Click on the configure link to set up this new action. We'll put some parameters in, so on the input mapping screen, expand the edit expense claim node, then expand the parameters node, and drag the ID parameter over to the expense claim ID input property as shown here. Make sure that you do drop this on the expense claim ID property and not just the ID property. Notice as well that this input property is required. Remember, we have to link expense claim line items with the expense claim header. Because this is the edit form, we actually have the expense claim ID of the header record in the ID form parameter. Backing up on the input mapping screen, let's expand the expense claim line items edit list, and then expand the expense claim line item smart object. From here, you can drag the properties for the smart object into the input mappings, as shown on my screen. Keep in mind, when you're using an editable list, this is the way you have to map the input properties for the list method. Do not use the controls on the edit list, but just use the properties, and then K2 will handle it from there. I'll go ahead and pause the video here to give you a second to do this. Okay, now let's click Next, and then Finish to complete the action configuration. The next thing we need to do is add an action that will update existing rows that the user may have modified in the Edit Item List view. So add another action to execute a view method for items that are in a specific state, and configure this action to execute the save method of the expense claim line items edit list view for all the items that have been changed. When you're ready, go ahead and click the configure link where we'll set up the action that updates the changed items. On the input mapping screen, let's drag all the properties from the expense claim line item smart object over to the input properties as shown on my screen. Again, for the sake of time, I'll pause the video here and come back with all the properties populated. So keep in mind, we do not have to use the ID form parameter this time for the expense claim ID. This is because the expense claim header ID already exists for an item that was changed instead of added. Now notice here I've got expense claim ID, ID, category ID, payee, date, description, amount, currency code, USD amount, and receipt. Make sure your screen looks like mine, and then when you're ready, let's click Finish to complete the mapping configuration. Now we will add a rule action to delete all the items that the user removed from the expense claims item list. Let's add this rule action called execute a view method for items that are in a specific state, and then configure this action to execute the delete method of the expense claim line items edit list view for all the items that have been removed. And when you're ready, click the configure link to set up the input mappings. The nice thing about this setup is the only mapping we need to do is the ID of the expense claim line item smart object, because that is the only value required to find and delete the row that was removed from the list of expense items. So keep in mind, again, open this up and pull it from the smart object of the line items. You can click Finish to complete the input mappings configuration when you're ready. After the save, update, and delete happens, we want to show the user a confirmation message saying that their expense claim was resubmitted. So add an action to show this message, and configure it as you see it on my screen here. So for message size, set that to medium. For message type, leave it as default. For title, enter in the word success. For heading, you can enter in claim resubmitted. And then for the body of the message, we're actually going to drag the title text box over after we put this in. So make sure that yours says your expense claim for the title text box has been resubmitted for approval. And you can drag that over from the context browser. At this point, we're going to close the browser after the message is displayed to the user. So let's add another action to close the browser window. So search for that action and then just add it in here on the right. The next thing we're going to do is set up the rule execution so that the data change operations all happen in a single batch. So in the rule actions section, select then on Edit Expense Claim view, execute the Update List Item method, and click on the word then and change it to the word also. Your screen should look like mine at this point after you do that. So let's do the expense claim line items methods now. In the rule actions section, let's select the then on expense claim line items edit list view, execute the create method for all the items that have been added action. And click on the word then and change it to also. Then select the expense claim line items edit list view, execute the save method for all the items that have been changed action, and change then to also. And finally, select the expense claim line items edit list view, execute the delete method for all items that have been removed action, and change then to also. Once you get that done, your rule actions should look like mine on the screen. Notice that all the data operations are grouped together as one batch action. This is going to make the form seem faster at runtime for your users. You can go ahead and click OK to complete the rule designer, and click Finish to complete the form designer and return to the application elements screen. I'll give you a few seconds to do this. Once you get back to the application elements screen, go ahead and check in all the forms and views for the application. We have made all the required changes for the edit form, so let's take a moment and go test our changes out. From the Application Elements page, you can do this by right-clicking the Edit Expense Claim form, and then from the menu that pops up, select Run with Parameters. On the parameter screen, provide a value for the ID parameter, and then click Run or click the URL at the bottom of the screen. In my case, I'm going to use the ID value as 1, since it's the first test item that I added to my list. Once the form opens up, it should populate with data and you should be able to make changes to the expense claim and expense claim line items. Let's try to edit some of the existing line items by adding another line item. I'll go ahead and delete one of the existing line items. And then I'll use the Resubmit Claim button to commit the changes. And then I'll reopen the list item from the Sharepoint list again. This looks pretty good, but if things did not work as expected on your form, the most likely cause is that you did not do the mappings of the ID parameter and the Smart Object properties correctly in the rule actions that work with the expense claim line items. You may want to go back and make sure that the expense claim ID is mapped correctly for the create and update methods. Let's do a quick review. In this step, we configure the form that will be used to edit expense claims. We will actually be using this form in the Workflow Rework task to allow the requester to change the expense claim and add, edit, or remove line items from the expense claim before resubmitting the claim for approval. So up to now, you have learned how to create data entities for systems outside of SharePoint. We've learned how to create views for those entities and then use those views on forms. In the next part of this tutorial, you will learn how to add workflow components to the application and configure the workflow integration rule actions for the forms that you've created.